Welcome back to Consumer Choice Radio. It is with great pleasure that I introduce our next guest. He served as the congressman for South Carolina's 1st Congressional District from 1995 to 2001. He was a two-term governor of that same very state from 2003 to 2011, and again served as a congressman in that same district from 2013 to 2019. Thank you very much for joining us, Governor Mark Sanford.
My pleasure.
Fantastic. So I'm a huge fan of your work. I'm a huge fan of what your priorities are. I mean, my kind of background goes to a bit of the Ron Paul era and Liberty Republicans, and you were always such a strong ally of those folks while you were both in Congress and in the governor's residence. But I'm curious as to what you've been up to since leaving Congress and what some of the big projects you're working on kind of post-politics.
Well, my big project over the last week was I was down at the farm running a traco, which is an excavator, one of those things on tracks with a bucket at the end, fiddling down there. And I always have projects going down at the farm, but I guess you're talking not a farm and other projects. And I'd say, it's been a chance to regroup and think. It's been a busy 26 years that I was in politics. And now it's been a chance for reflection. And so it's been a lot of that and thinking about what do I want to do when I grow up and all that sort of thing. But it's also been a chance to think about really what was my life's work, which was how do we get our arms around an unsustainable debt train that frankly could be the undoing our civilization and our way of life. And for that reason, with some others, started a little group called AFDDR, Americans for Debt and Deficit Reduction. And the idea, and it may be like the boy in Holland sticking his finger in the dike, it may be an impossible task, but we're trying to raise some measure of awareness to the national debt, which nobody's talking about. The reason I did the whole messaging thing last fall, I wasn't delusional about becoming president of the United States, but the buddies that had encouraged it, their point was, Mark, you've already invested 25 years of your life. What's another couple of months if you might be able to raise and elevate this issue of debt and deficit spending? And it turns out that was a waste of time, but we're trying another bite at the apple with this little group called Americans for Debt and Deficit Reduction.org, AFDDR.org.
And Governor Sanford, it's something that, I think many of us were very cognizant of, at least in the more center-right movement, the idea that there are debt and deficits that will choke the futures of our children, those who are born now, but even those who might be in the next generation. But obviously we have this entire huge monkey wrench called the coronavirus. And, we thought trillion-dollar numbers were a rarity and only, for large bank bailouts, but now it's part of the everyday conversation with these coronavirus packages. What does all this spending mean for the future of our debt and deficits? And do you think we've gotten too comfortable with throwing around these huge amounts from the federal government?
Yeah, the snakes don't hurt till they bite you. I think that we've, to your point, grown sort of accustomed and desensitized to the consequences of debt. I'm reading a fascinating book right now on the Weimar Republic, and as you may remember during that time, and it really set the stage for Hitler's rise to power, because people were carrying as much as a wheelbarrow load of currency to buy so much as a loaf of bread. And in that kind of desperation, people turn to whoever has the loudest claim, the best answer, and for some reason people thought he did, and we know what happened from there. But what's telling is the 10-year time period, it was just 10 years. So we're not talking about our kids' time or our grandkids' time. In a 10-year time frame, basically the wheels came completely off in Germany, which was a highly educated, open political system at that time. And so I just think that, one, we need to remember, in fact, there's a fascinating book I'd recommend to both of you and to listeners, if you have insomnia, that is. It's called This Time It's Different. And it was written by a professor from Harvard and a professor from the University of Maryland. And what they did was Reinhardt and Rogoff. They chronicled the last 800 years. Let me say that number again: the last 800 years of financial history as it relates to government. There's been some question of their methodology, and I think that is legitimate. But the larger point that they make is an accurate one, and that is that basically civilizations get to a tipping point wherein they have to decide: do we go back to what made us competitive and perhaps a world power in the first place? Or do we stay on this happy but ultimately unsustainable cycle of upward government spending, upward government consumption? And 9 times out of 10, what policymakers at that time said was, well, this time it's different. And of course, it never was. Gravity always works. And it was the seeds of that civilization's undoing. And so another book I'd recommend is Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers. What he talks about was the absolute correlation between economic supremacy and military supremacy. You can't have one without the other. That's what undid the old, former Soviet Union. And so I just think that, one, we've become inured and sort of open to big deficits, but we're not looking at the pages of history and how immediate and quick the consequences can be. I think the consequences are going to come to us, frankly, over the next 10 years, maybe even 5 years.
On that note of history, and this is some of my opinion in terms of the Trump administration before COVID. I feel like the RNC in many instances has somewhat abandoned that traditional viewpoint of fiscal responsibility in terms of spending and debt. And I'd love to hear your take on where the RNC maybe lost its way. I mean, in my mind, I think back to, Ron Paul being Mr. No, even yourself when you were in the governor's office. I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, there was an attempt to not accept a huge federal stimulus package, which for fiscal conservatives was, I think, quite commendable. But yeah, what's your take on the RNC and where the party has moved in terms of its approach to fiscal responsibility?
The party has abandoned fiscal responsibility of late. I mean, the problem with party is whatever the party is that's out of power becomes the, quote, responsible party as it relates to spending. But he who holds the power, he who holds the gold, wants to spend the gold. And so I think that both parties have been guilty. I think that Trump has taken us down a bad road. That was my real beef with him. He does not care. He's called himself the king of debt. He had a different life experience that led him to feel okay with debt. One was he had a very rich dad, very rich, and so bailed him out at some early points that would have crushed the average, real estate entrepreneur out there. And then, the saying is, if you borrow a little, the bank owns you. If you borrow a lot, you own the bank. And he borrowed a lot, and it worked out pretty well for him. But that's not the case for me and you in public world. When a government defaults, there's a profound consequence to every one of us in the form of higher prices through inflation, through the devaluation of the currency, which could be our life savings. A lot of bad things happen. There is a financial consequence. So there's not a free lunch on this one. I think the RNC has absolutely lost its way. And sadly, the DNC is no better. If you look at the spending proposals, you're like, oh my goodness, everybody's gone to la-la land as it relates to financial reality on both the Republican and Democratic side of late.
We're speaking with former South Carolina Governor Mark Sanford here on the Big Talker 106.7 FM. And Governor, I have to ask, I love that portion of the beginning of the interview. You talked about working on the farm. It's just like we envisioned in the Constitution. People go in, they work as legislators, they go back to their farms, they put down the political pens and pick up the pitchfork. One question I have is about federalism and the role of the states versus the federal government. Definitely the states are usually, because of many, balanced budget amendments and things, better stewards. Is there a role of maybe the state governments in some way putting pressure on the federal government when it comes to all this spending and debt? Is there anything that states can do? Do we have to go back to federalism? Do we have to talk about maybe a new way to organize our financial system? What are some more, I guess, local answers to our debt problem and things that we could solve?
One is duration in office. You know, I've never been more than 8 years in one office. I was, 2 terms as governor. I did 6 years in the House, and another time it's another 6 years in the House. But you used to have somebody that stays there, king of the hill, for 20 years. They lose perspective, and I think it's important. Our founding fathers, they rotated in and out of politics. It wasn't as if Jefferson wasn't involved in public policy the whole of his life, but he was in and out of different things. And I think that one, the notion of term limits and not sticking around forever, to your point, is important. I think that federalism is vital, but it's dead right now. I mean, states have become sort of the stepchildren of the federal government, and they're plaintiffs to the federal government for funds. And there's, you don't see a lot of real strong pushback. I mean, when I attempted to turn back the Obama stimulus money, which at that time was a minuscule number, is $800 million, which is a rounding error these days. It ultimately went to the Supreme Court and we lost. But I think that the legislative bodies at the state level and at the federal level have weakened themselves, at times turning decisions over the courts that really don't need to be made by the courts, and in many cases turning decisions over to the federal government that don't need to be made by the federal government.
And what's your take on the opinion, and I know this has been expressed a couple times in the Wall Street Journal, that maybe some Democratic governors are using the COVID crisis to essentially line up at the trough now for federal bailout money to try and fix issues that existed in terms of their checkbooks prior to COVID. Is that something that you see happening? Would it be appropriate for the federal government to bail out states, or should they have a hands-off approach and maybe let some of the states manage themselves through their fiscal crisis?
Yeah, it'd be much better. It ain't gonna happen, but it'd be much better. I mean, it is crazy. I was reading an article the other day on what a disaster New York City is right now financially. I mean, you look at, I can't remember the number, but it was multi-billion-dollar deficits for a city, for New York City. And the New York State was dealing with some of the same things. And so, no, I mean, what you can't have is what you always have in politics, which is, diffuse cost and concentrated benefit. And so he who, gets something really hangs on to it, and they spread the cost to everybody else. But states have been really bad. If you look at Illinois, look at the pension system in Illinois, look at the pension system in California. The idea of the firemen and the policemen in South Carolina or North Carolina subsidizing the outrageous pension that somebody in California gets. I mean, I was looking at some of these public workers making more than $300,000 or more than $800,000 a year in California, and you're going, "This is public service? Give me a break." And what's sad is that it really means that the policeman or fireman in South or North Carolina or Georgia or other southern states is subsidizing those hefty places. And what's really crazy is people are moving out of the Northeast and out of the high tax states to lower tax states like South Carolina, Florida, wherever, and it's going to get worse. You look at the number of folks moving out of New York. Every time I drive around Charleston now, I see another New York plate. It's somebody else moving down here, and they still are leaving the cost system in place. And so, yeah, it's going to be a mess. And who bails out the bailout? I mean, the federal government is deep in hawk. We're running structural deficits. If you look at the overall numbers, we've run about $7 trillion worth of stimulus this year, about 4 on the Fed side, about 3 on the fiscal side. $7 trillion. You can have quite a party if you throw $7 trillion at it. But when the party ends, it's gonna hurt all of us. So I don't think we're in a position to do that federally, but that's what will happen. And it's going to, again, continue this downward cycle for all of us in terms of the spending train.
Former governor Mark Sanford, former representative, current statesman, current farmer, and now a fighter against the debt. Thank you so much for coming on the program. Where can our listeners find your current project and anything else that you'll be working on in the future?
Yeah, just ask them to go and kick the tires and just learn a little bit more about why they ought to care about the debt issue for themselves and those that they love. And they could go to afddr.org. Again, that's Americans for Debt and Deficit Reduction.org, afddr.org. And again, look at some of the numbers and draw their own conclusions.
Thank you so much, Governor. A pleasure to talk. Thank you for being on the Big Talker FM.
Yes, sir. Thank you.